Before the first god was named, before power was divided and fate was assigned, the world existed in a way that no longer feels possible. Not empty, not chaotic, but suspended, as if reality itself had not yet decided how to behave. There was no need for judgment, because nothing yet stood apart. No need for creation, because nothing had been separated. What the Sumerians preserved from this time does not resemble a myth of origin in the modern sense. It reads instead like the residue of a memory, something remembered not because it was dramatic, but because its loss reshaped everything that followed. We are accustomed to beginning ancient history with rulers, gods, and cosmic hierarchies, yet the earliest Sumerian texts quietly refuse this structure. They do not begin with authority. They do not begin with intervention. They begin with a condition. This is where modern interpretation falters, because when we search these texts for advanced beings, lost technologies, or visitors from the sky, we miss the more unsettling implication that the Sumerians were not describing who created the world, but what the world was like before creation became necessary at all. What follows is not a story about gods arriving, but about a reality withdrawing, leaving behind echoes that civilization would spend thousands of years trying to understand. There is a moment before every story begins, before the names, before the faces, before the voices that speak and argue and command. A moment so distant that even memory does not survive it intact. If you read the Sumerian texts closely, slowly, without the expectations of modern myth or science fiction, you begin to notice something unsettling. The earliest layers do not open with gods descending from the sky, nor with beings shaping humanity in their image. They open with something far quieter, something far older. They open with water, not rivers, not rain, not oceans as we know them, but a boundless, undivided expanse, an existence without edges, without direction, without time. The Sumerians called it Namu. Later scribes would translate the name as the primordial sea, but even that feels inadequate. Namu was not simply water. She was the condition that made existence possible, the state before differentiation, the memory of a world before the world. In these earliest passages, Namu is not described as a goddess in the familiar sense. She has no face carved into stone, no temples dedicated to her daily worship, no myths of jealousy or love or war. She is something more abstract, more difficult. Namu exists before sky and earth, before breath, before light. She is not a character in a story. She is the background against which all stories would eventually unfold. This matters more than it seems, because if the Sumerians believed that existence itself emerged from an undivided, timeless state, then their mythology is not beginning with gods. It is beginning with a memory of a different world. A world that operated under rules so alien to our own that it could only be described through metaphor, through water, through silence. The oldest tablets tell us that in this primordial condition there was no separation, no above and below, no land and sky. Everything that would later become distinct was folded into a single suspended state. There was no wind because there was no space for wind to move through, no sound because sound requires air, no passage of time because nothing changed. To the modern mind, this can sound like philosophy or poetry, but for the Sumerians, it was memory encoded as myth, a way of preserving knowledge that could not be expressed directly. And before we drift any deeper into this memory, take a quiet moment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is there right now. I always find it grounding to see how these ancient questions travel across the world, reaching different places, different nights, different hours of silence. And as always, the images you may see here are only meant to suggest atmosphere and context, not to define meaning. Thank you for being here and for allowing these forgotten stories to unfold with you. And this is where we must pause. because nowhere in this earliest layer do the Anunnaki appear. They are absent entirely. No councils, no judgments, no decrees of fate, no beings descending or arriving. The Anunnaki, so central in modern retellings, do not belong to this first world. They come later, much later, and that single fact quietly undermines nearly every popular interpretation that places them at the beginning of human history. Instead, the Sumerian texts suggest something more unsettling, that there was an order of existence before gods had personalities, before authority was assigned, before hierarchy solidified. A world remembered not through stories of action, but through states of being. Water without shores, silence without listeners, time without direction. This is not the world of civilizations. It is the world before civilizations were even imaginable. Archaeology gives us only fragments of how old these ideas truly are. At Eridu, the city the Sumerians themselves called the first city, layers of occupation stretch back thousands of years before written history begins. Beneath temples, beneath mud brick houses, beneath ritual platforms, there are older levels, simpler, quieter, evidence of a long continuity rather than a sudden beginning. The priests of Eridu believed their city stood at the edge of creation itself, that beneath its foundations lay the Abzu, the same primordial waters associated with Namu. To build there was to build on memory. To live there was to exist at the boundary between the present world and something vastly older. When later generations copied these texts, they did so with reverence. Scribal traditions preserved the names, the sequences, the relationships, even when the original meanings had begun to fade. That alone tells us something important. The Sumerians understood that these stories were not inventions, they were inheritances, and inheritances carry responsibility. As centuries passed, gods would gain form, sky would separate from earth, wind would move, time would begin to flow in cycles humans could measure. But the Sumerians never forgot that this ordered world rested on something older, something unstable, that beneath structure lay dissolution, beneath names lay namelessness. This idea appears again and again, not just in myth, but in ritual. Water is used to purify, to erase, to return things to an earlier state. Temples are washed, statues are bathed. Even kings undergo symbolic cleansing, as if power itself must periodically be returned to the primordial source before it can continue. The world before the Anunnaki was not ruled. It was not governed. It simply existed. And perhaps that is why it could not last. As order emerged, so did tension. As separation occurred, imbalance followed. The very act of creating space between sky and earth, between gods and humans, introduced fragility into existence. What had once been unified became vulnerable to collapse. This is the unspoken undercurrent of the Sumerian worldview. Creation is not purely positive, it is a loss as much as a gain. Something is always sacrificed when order replaces unity. We see echoes of this idea far beyond Mesopotamia. In Egypt, creation begins with the waters of none. In Vedic texts, the universe emerges from undifferentiated chaos. Even modern cosmology, stripped of myth, speaks of a singularity, a state where time and space as we know them do not yet exist. Different languages, different symbols, the same intuition, that before the world we inhabit, there was another condition entirely. And the Sumerians believed they remembered it. As we move forward, the silence of Namu will not disappear. It will retreat, fold itself beneath layers of gods, kings, cities, and catastrophes. But it will remain present, beneath the flood stories, beneath the creation of humanity, beneath the rise of divine authority, a buried world beneath the world. In the next part, we will witness the first great rupture in this ancient memory, the moment when unity could no longer be sustained. when heaven and earth were forced apart and existence as we recognize it began, not gently but violently. Because once separation occurs, there is no return. Imagine a world without distance, not just the absence of travel, but the absence of space itself. No above, no below, no horizon where land meets sky, because land and sky have not yet learned that they are different things. This is the condition the Sumerian texts struggle to describe, a state so unlike human experience that it can only be approached indirectly, through fragments of language and careful metaphor. After Namu, but before the familiar gods, the texts speak of An and Ki, heaven and earth, not as places and not yet as personalities, but as principles, vast, inseparable forces pressed together in a single mass. In this earliest configuration of reality, heaven did not hover above the world, it lay directly upon it. Earth did not rest beneath the sky, it was fused to it. There was no air between them, no room for weather, no space for breath. To modern ears this can sound symbolic, but to the Sumerians it was structural. This was how the universe existed before it became habitable. In the absence of separation, nothing could move. There was no circulation of wind, no rising of clouds, no falling of rain. Sound itself could not exist, because sound requires vibration through air. Even light, though present in some undefined form, had no medium through which to travel. Everything that would later animate the world, storms, seasons, growth, decay, was locked in suspension. This was not paradise, it was inertia. The Sumerian creation texts do not romanticize this state. They do not describe it as peaceful or benevolent. Instead, they portray it as static, unproductive, and ultimately unlivable. Potential existed, but it could not express itself. Life, as the Sumerians understood it, required division. This detail is crucial, because it tells us that the world before the Anunnaki was not a golden age of gods walking freely among humans. It was something stranger and more fragile, a cosmic condition that could not sustain complexity, a world that had to be broken in order for anything else to emerge. Here, the texts begin to hint at a pattern that will repeat again and again throughout Sumerian memory. Creation through rupture. An and Ki are described as locked together, their union so complete that there is no space for differentiation. Later traditions will personify them as husband and wife, but in the earliest layers, that imagery is absent. This is not a marriage, it is a compression, a universe with no room to breathe. Comparative mythology offers striking parallels. In ancient Egypt, the sky goddess Nut is said to have once rested directly upon the earth god Geb, until they were forcibly separated to create the world. In Vedic tradition, heaven and earth are likewise described as once pressed together before being torn apart. These are not stories of harmony lost. They are stories of necessity. Something had to give, and according to the Sumerians, what gave was unity itself. The texts do not dwell long on this fused world, perhaps because there was little to dwell on. No events occurred there. No actions could take place. There were no cycles to observe, no narratives to record. It is remembered not for what happened, but for what could not happen. This may explain why later gods, especially the Anunnaki, have no place in this phase of existence. There was no structure within which roles could exist, no hierarchy, no authority, no judgment. Fate itself had not yet been assigned. The Anunnaki, whose name later becomes associated with decrees and destinies, require a world where decisions matter, where actions produce consequences. In the fused state of An and Ki, there were no consequences because there was no movement. In this sense, the Sumerians remembered the pre-Anunnaki world not as a civilization, not as an advanced society, but as a cosmic precondition, a necessary but temporary state that had to end. And when it ended violently. But before that rupture occurs, the texts linger just long enough to leave us with an unsettling thought, that this fused world was stable, not chaotic, not dangerous, simply inert. And that inertia may have been more terrifying than disorder. A universe without change is a universe without meaning. This is a difficult idea, and the Sumerians do not spell it out directly. They let it emerge through implication, through absence, through the stark contrast between what existed before and what followed. Later myths will overflow with conflict, gods arguing, competing, deceiving one another. Storms will rage, floods will come, time will stretch and contract. Human lives will be shaped by forces beyond their control. All of that depends on separation. But here, in this early moment, none of it exists. No storms, no floods, no kings, no deaths. Only a universe pressed flat against itself. Some scholars have suggested that this description may reflect an intuitive understanding of deep geological or cosmological time. A memory not of events, but of conditions. Others argue that it reflects philosophical speculation about the nature of existence. The truth is likely somewhere in between. Myth and memory are not opposites in ancient thought. They are collaborators. What matters is that the Sumerians preserved this phase deliberately. They did not skip directly from chaos to order. They recorded an intermediate state, a world that existed but could not endure. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If the Sumerians remembered a world that had to be broken for life to continue, what else might they have remembered about transitions between worlds? What other ruptures lie buried beneath later stories of gods and heroes? The answer begins with a single name, Enlil, the one who forced space into existence, the one who introduced wind, breath, and motion into a silent universe, the one whose act of separation made the world livable, but also set the pattern for every catastrophe that would follow. Because once the sky was torn from the earth, the age of stillness ended forever, and the age of storms began. There is no gentle language in the Sumerian texts for what came next. The moment heaven and earth were separated is not described as an awakening or a blossoming. It is described as force, pressure released through violence, a necessary act that shattered a static universe and replaced it with motion, sound, and risk. The name bound to this moment is Enlil. In later myths, Enlil becomes a ruler, a judge, a god of storms and authority. But here, in the earliest layers, he is something more elemental. He is not yet a king. He is an action, the embodiment of separation itself. The texts tell us that Enlil thrust heaven upward and pressed earth downward. In doing so, he created the space between them, the air, the breath, the unseen medium through which everything else would move. This space did not exist before, and once it existed, the universe could no longer return to stillness. Wind entered the world. For the first time, something moved without being pushed. Invisible forces travelled across open space. Sound could now exist. So could smell. So could speech. So could life. But the Sumerians never portray this as a purely positive transformation. They understood that separation created vulnerability. Once there was space between heaven and earth, that space could fill with storms, with drought, with imbalance. The same air that carried breath could carry destruction. The same wind that cooled fields could flatten them. Creation in this worldview is not the opposite of catastrophe. It is the first catastrophe. This idea runs like a fault line through Sumerian thought. The gods do not create the world by arranging it carefully. They tear it apart so something new can happen. Order emerges not from harmony, but from fracture. We see this reflected again and again in the natural world the Sumerians lived within. Southern Mesopotamia was a land shaped by violent forces, rivers that flooded without warning, winds that scoured fields, heat that could kill crops in days. Survival depended on reading instability, not denying it. So when the texts describe Enlil's act, they are not imagining a distant cosmic event. They are describing the logic of the world they knew. The sky rises, the earth hardens, and between them danger is born. This act marks the true beginning of time. Before separation, nothing changed. After separation, everything changes constantly. The movement of clouds marks seasons. The length of shadows marks days. The passage of wind carries signals of what is coming: rain, dust, destruction. Time, as experienced by humans, requires space, and space is born here in this violent moment. It is also here that the older world truly ends. Whatever existed before, whatever unity, stillness, or suspended potential defined that earlier condition, could not survive the creation of distance. The world after Enlil is not simply different. It is incompatible with what came before. This is why the Sumerians never describe a return to the primordial state. Floods may cover the land, cities may vanish, civilizations may reset, but the sky never falls back onto the earth. Separation is permanent, and permanence carries consequences. Enlil's domain becomes the air itself, the space of storms and breath and authority. He does not rule from the highest heaven, nor from the depths of the earth. He rules the unstable middle, the realm where human life will exist, where crops will grow or fail, where noise will eventually rise high enough to disturb the gods. This detail matters because it foreshadows everything that follows. The Sumerians believed that the most dangerous place in existence was not the heavens and not the underworld, but the world in between, the inhabited world, the realm where gods and humans interact, where creation and destruction overlap. This is where Enlil's influence is strongest. Later myths will portray him as harsh, inflexible, quick to anger. These traits do not come from nowhere. They are extensions of his original function. He is the force that enforces separation, and separation requires boundaries, limits, consequences. Once heaven and earth are torn apart, hierarchy begins to form. Above, the remote heavens, increasingly distant and difficult to access. Below, the solid earth, capable of supporting life, but also of burying it. Between, the domain of wind, breath, storms, and command. It is within this structure that later gods will take their places. It is within this structure that humans will be created. It is within this structure that fate itself becomes meaningful. And still, the memory of the earlier world lingers. The Sumerians never forgot that this order was imposed, not natural, that it could fail, that the forces holding sky and earth apart required constant maintenance, rituals, offerings, obedience, noise control. If the air became too chaotic, too filled with disturbance, the balance could collapse, not back into unity, but into destruction. This is why Enlil is both creator and destroyer. He does not bring life out of kindness. He allows it to exist because it fits within the structure he enforces. When it no longer fits, he removes it. We see echoes of this logic in later stories. The decision to send the flood, the refusal to rescind decrees, the insistence on silence and order. Enlil does not act out of malice. He acts out of necessity as he understands it. The separation of heaven and earth was the first time necessity overruled stability, and that pattern will repeat. The wind that entered the world in this moment never stops moving. It carries memory with it, erosion, change. It scours mountains into dust. It dries rivers. It reshapes landscapes slowly enough that humans forget it is happening until disaster arrives. The Sumerians watched this constantly. Dust storms rolling across the plains, floodwaters erasing boundaries between fields and cities, the land itself reminding them that order is temporary. So when they spoke of Enlil's first act, they were not telling a distant myth. They were describing the condition of existence itself, a world that must be actively held apart to remain livable. And once separation exists, something else becomes possible. Depth, because if the sky is above and the earth is below, then something can exist beneath the earth as well. Something hidden, something older, something that remembers what came before separation. That place has a name, Abzu. We will descend, not upward into the heavens, but downward into the waters beneath the world, to the realm where memory pools, where creation draws its substance, where the old world did not vanish, but retreated, because not everything that is broken is destroyed. Some things simply sink. If the sky was torn away from the earth, something else happened at the same moment, something the Sumerians understood instinctively, even if they could not have explained it in modern terms, because the world did not simply gain height with the opening of the heavens above. It gained depth, a downward dimension that mirrored the sky itself, a hidden vertical axis into which the memory of the older world retreated rather than vanished. The Sumerians called this place Abzu, a term later flattened into the simple phrase freshwater abyss, yet in doing so much of its meaning was lost, because Abzu was never merely water beneath the ground. It was the residue of the primordial state itself, the last place where the old rules still applied, a submerged remainder of the world that had existed before separation, before structure, before imposed order. Unlike the heavens, which grew increasingly distant and inaccessible as divine hierarchies hardened, the Abzu was always close, always present beneath the feet of the living, something you could touch, reach, and hear when water bubbled unexpectedly from the earth. Southern Mesopotamia sits upon an unusually high water table, and the Sumerians observed that no matter where one dug, water would eventually appear, wells forming where none had been before, springs emerging without warning, rivers seeming to rise from the ground itself rather than flow down from the sky. And to the Sumerian mind, this was not coincidence, but confirmation, proof that the earth itself floated upon an endless freshwater ocean, and that beneath that ocean lay memory rather than emptiness. This belief was not abstract or symbolic, but practical and architectural, shaping how cities were founded and where sacred spaces were anchored. Eridu, the city the Sumerians themselves named as the first city, was believed to sit directly above the Abzu, not metaphorically but physically, its main temple bearing the name Abzu, the House of the Abyss, a declaration that civilization itself rested not on solid ground but on water, on instability, on something far older than order. Archaeology reinforces this perception, as Eridu is among the oldest known urban settlements in human history, with layers of occupation reaching back to the 6th millennium BCE, long before monumental temples, long before kings, long before written law, when ritual alone marked humanity's attempt to negotiate with forces it could not control, and beneath every layer the persistent presence of water remained. The god most closely associated with the Abzu was Enki, and unlike Enlil, who ruled through command, separation, and authority in the open sky, Enki ruled through understanding, adaptation, and hidden pathways, his domain not the visible heavens, but the unseen currents beneath the surface. Enki dwelled in the Abzu not as a prisoner, but as a custodian, because he remembered what lay below and what came before, and where Enlil enforced boundaries, Enki navigated between them, understanding loopholes, subtleties, and the art of survival in a world shaped by imposed limits. This contrast was foundational to the Sumerian worldview, which did not place all authority in the heavens, but divided power between above, below, and the unstable realm in between, recognizing that the world beneath, the Abzu, was not evil or corrupt, but fertile and dangerous at the same time, capable of sustaining life even as it threatened to reclaim it. Fresh water, after all, was what made agriculture possible, and without irrigation Mesopotamia could not exist, meaning that the same waters capable of flooding cities were also the waters that allowed them to rise in the first place. This duality was never resolved by the Sumerians, only accepted, and when they imagined the Abzu, they did not imagine darkness or punishment, reserving that imagery for Kur, the underworld of the dead, because Abzu was different, creative rather than terminal, the source from which rivers flowed and from which clay was drawn, the same clay that would later be used to create humanity itself. This detail was not incidental, because when Enki and the birth goddess Ninmah shaped the first humans, they did not use soil from cultivated fields or dust from the surface world, but clay taken from the Abzu, material that still carried the essence of the primordial state, meaning that humanity, in Sumerian thought, was formed from what the world used to be rather than solely from what it had become. This placed humans in an uneasy position, not purely creatures of the ordered world, but beings partially shaped from what existed before order, carrying instability within them, memory of an older condition, a restlessness that never fully settles. And perhaps this is why humans make noise. The Sumerians never framed this noise as rebellion or sin, but as a natural consequence of primordial echoes reverberating through an imposed structure. What happens when beings shaped from ancient material attempt to live within boundaries that were never meant for them? Abzu, then, was not only beneath the ground but beneath civilization itself, present every time a river overflowed its banks, every time the soil softened and collapsed, every time wells refilled without visible cause, a constant reminder that the ordered world floated upon something it could not fully control. Rituals performed at Eridu acknowledged this reality, as offerings were poured not only upward to the sky gods, but downward into the earth, libations flowing toward the Abzu, returning substance to source, because direction mattered, upward offerings honoring authority, while downward offerings honored memory. The Sumerians believed that when balance failed, it failed from below as much as from above, because floods did not fall from the sky alone, but rose from the earth, waters surging upward to reclaim land and return the surface world to something closer to its earlier state. This is why flood myths occupy such a central place in Sumerian tradition, not as punishments, but as reversions, temporary collapses of separation, moments when the Abzu pushed back against imposed order. Crucially, this entire framework predates the Anunnaki, because there are no judges here, no decrees of fate, no councils assigning human destiny, only structure, pressure, and memory, the mechanics of existence itself. The Anunnaki will enter the story later, once fate becomes something that can be assigned and judgment becomes necessary. Once the world has drifted far enough from its origins that rules must be enforced rather than remembered. But here, in the Abzu, rules do not yet exist, only currents. As the surface world grows more complex, order does not arrive all at once or through command, but emerges gradually through repetition, as cycles of sun, moon, and stars begin to impose rhythm on instability, and hierarchy forms not in the depths, but on the surface itself, because before fate could be judged or decreed, there first had to exist patterns worth preserving, patterns shaped not in the heavens, but in the slow, repeating movements of light across a world that had finally learned how to breathe. As the world above the Abzu slowly stabilized, as wind learned its paths and water learned its boundaries, a new kind of order began to surface, not imposed through force or judgment, but through rhythm, repetition, and predictability. And it is here that the Sumerian texts introduce a generation of gods whose presence feels fundamentally different from those who would come later. These were not judges of fate or enforcers of decrees, but embodiments of cycles, manifestations of movements that could be observed, measured, and relied upon, because before destiny could be assigned and before laws could be enforced, the world first had to learn how to repeat itself. The sun rose and set, casting shadows that stretched and withdrew with regularity. And in that repetition, the Sumerians recognized Utu, not merely as a god of light, but as the principle that made justice possible, because only a world governed by cycles could sustain fairness, memory, and consequence. The moon waxed and waned, marking time not in abstract units, but in visible transformation, and in that slow, dependable change they recognized Nana, the keeper of months, tides, and the deep pull between earth and sky that governed both water and blood. Above them both, the stars traced paths across the night, patterns that returned year after year, subtle but unwavering, and in these movements the Sumerians saw not messages from distant realms, but confirmations that the world, once static and then violently torn open, had begun to settle into something that could be lived within. Inanna emerged from this ordered surface not as a contradiction, but as a culmination, a goddess whose nature reflected the instability that still lingered beneath structure, embodying fertility and war, love and destruction, growth and collapse. Because the Sumerians understood that cycles alone did not eliminate danger, they merely organized it. Inanna's power lay not in enforcing rules, but in crossing boundaries, moving between realms, disrupting stagnation, and reminding both gods and humans that balance was not a fixed state, but a constant negotiation. She was the echo of the Abzu rising into the surface world, the reminder that creation and destruction were never fully separate. What is striking in these early texts is not simply who appears, but who does not, because the Anunnaki are still absent, and their absence is telling. The world at this stage does not yet require judges, councils, or formal decrees of fate, because the rhythms of existence are still sufficient to govern life. Crops grow and fail according to seasons. Rivers rise and fall according to distant rains. Birth and death follow patterns that, while harsh, remain intelligible. Authority emerges not through command but through observation, through alignment with cycles that appear older and stronger than any individual will. This worldview reflects a deep attentiveness to the natural environment of Mesopotamia, where survival depended on understanding repetition rather than control, because no king could command the rivers, no god could prevent the winds from shifting unexpectedly, and so wisdom lay in reading signs, adapting to rhythms, and honoring forces that revealed themselves gradually. Temples aligned with celestial events, festivals followed lunar calendars, and myths encoded agricultural knowledge into divine narrative, not to dominate nature, but to remain in step with it. These gods of cycle and rhythm were not distant abstractions, but intimate presences woven into daily life, felt in the timing of planting and harvest, in the lengthening and shortening of days, in the quiet assurance that even after disaster, the sun would return. And yet, beneath this surface order, tension remained, because cycles alone could not resolve the growing complexity of the world, especially as human populations increased and settlements expanded, amplifying the very instability that order sought to contain. The Sumerian texts hint at this pressure subtly, through shifts in tone rather than explicit declaration, as hymns begin to emphasize control alongside harmony, and divine relationships grow more hierarchical, suggesting that rhythm was no longer enough. The world had moved further from its origins, further from the quiet memory of the Abzu, and with that distance came the need for new structures, new roles, and eventually new enforcers. It is at this threshold that the Anunnaki will finally appear, not as creators of the cosmos, but as administrators of a system that has grown too complex to govern itself through cycles alone. Their arrival will mark a turning point, not the beginning of order, but the beginning of judgment, a sign that the world of rhythms and repetitions is giving way to a world of decisions and consequences. But before that shift can occur, something else must happen, because the surface world, now rich with pattern and life, will require labor to sustain it, and the gods, bound by their own rhythms, will begin to feel the weight of maintenance. And so, quietly and without spectacle, the stage is set for the creation of humanity, not as an act of cosmic ambition, but as a practical response to a world that has become too alive, too demanding, and too noisy to maintain on its own. Because when cycles alone can no longer hold chaos at bay, something new must be shaped from the old, drawn up from the Abzu, and given breath within the fragile space between heaven and earth. By the time the rhythms of the surface world had settled into something recognizable, the balance that sustained them had begun to strain, not because the cycles had failed, but because they demanded constant upkeep, and the gods themselves were bound by those same cycles they embodied. The Sumerian texts describe a world that had become alive enough to require maintenance, fields that needed tending, canals that needed clearing, temples that needed care, and rituals that needed repetition. And it was here, in this quiet accumulation of labour, that the next transformation began, not with thunder or separation, but with fatigue. The lesser gods, tasked with sustaining the rhythms of the world, grew weary, and their exhaustion is described not as rebellion, but as inevitability, because an ordered world demands work, and even divine forces have limits when bound to repetition. In the Atrahasis tradition, they complain of endless toil, of digging canals and maintaining the land, of performing the same tasks over and over as the world they had stabilized continued to expand, and this moment reveals something critical about Sumerian cosmology, because it frames creation not as a grand design, but as an ongoing logistical problem. Order is expensive, and someone must pay the cost. It is at this point that Enki re-enters the story, not from the sky but from below, carrying with him the memory of the Abzu and the knowledge of how old material can be reshaped to solve new problems. Alongside the birth goddess, Ninmah, Enki proposes a solution that is practical rather than idealistic, a being formed not to dominate the world or inherit it, but to share the burden of sustaining it. Humanity is conceived not as a masterpiece, but as a compromise. The substance chosen for this creation is telling, because it is not taken from the surface world of fields and cities, but drawn again from the clay of the Abzu, the same primordial material that still carries the imprint of the earlier world. Mixed with divine essence, this clay becomes something new, something neither fully God nor fully earth, and the texts linger on the experimental nature of this act, describing multiple attempts, some flawed, some incomplete, some producing bodies that cannot see, cannot walk, cannot hear. These imperfections are not erased from the narrative, because they are not mistakes to be hidden, but features of a world still negotiating its own balance. Humanity, then, is not created perfect, because perfection would require stability that no longer exists. Instead, humans are adaptable, resilient, capable of learning and failing and adjusting, qualities inherited directly from the unstable mixture of primordial matter and divine intent. This is why humans can thrive in conditions that gods find burdensome, why they can endure repetition without stagnation, and why they can multiply without fully understanding the consequences of their own growth. Yet this origin places humans in an uneasy position within the cosmic order, because they are formed from what the world used to be, but must live within what the world has become. They carry the memory of the Abzu in their substance and the demands of the surface world in their function, and this tension expresses itself not as conscious rebellion, but as restlessness, as movement, as noise. Humans speak, shout, sing, argue, build and expand, filling the air with activity, and in doing so they slowly push against the boundaries that Enlil works to maintain. The Sumerian texts do not describe this as moral failure, because morality in this sense has not yet crystallized. Instead, it is described as consequence, as what happens when beings shaped from ancient material are placed into a world governed by imposed order. Noise is not sin, but friction, the sound of incompatible states rubbing against one another. Humanity's success is also its problem, because the more effectively humans maintain the surface world, the more alive and crowded that world becomes. This is the first time the Sumerian narrative allows us to see humanity not as central protagonists, but as symptoms of a deeper imbalance, necessary and yet disruptive, created to preserve order and yet destined to strain it. Humans are neither favoured nor despised in these early texts. They are functional, a solution that works well enough to reveal the next problem. As settlements grow and agriculture expands, as canals stretch farther and fields multiply, the surface world begins to hum with activity, and the air, once empty and silent, fills with sound. Enlil, whose domain is the space between heaven and earth, becomes increasingly aware of this disturbance, not because humans have offended him, but because the structure he enforces is under stress. The world is changing again, not through separation, but through accumulation. And so, without announcement or warning, the stage is set for another transition, one that will not be solved by creation alone, because the solution that once relieved divine labour has introduced a new instability into the system. The Abzu has given rise to humanity. Humanity has filled the world with motion, and the air now carries more than wind and breath. It carries the sound of a species that does not know when to be quiet. As the implications of this development deepen, the Sumerian texts begin to measure time itself differently, stretching human history backward into impossibly long reigns, as if attempting to reconcile the memory of an earlier world with the reality of a crowded one, revealing that the problem is not simply humanity's noise, but the way time now moves across a world that no longer resembles its origins. As humanity settled into the surface world and noise became a constant presence rather than an anomaly, the Sumerian texts begin to do something strange, something that at first glance appears impossible, because they stretch time itself far beyond anything the modern mind is prepared to accept. Listing kings who ruled not for decades or even centuries, but for tens of thousands of years, reigns so vast that they seem to belong to another reality entirely. These antediluvian kings are not presented as legends in the way heroes are, nor are they framed as metaphors meant to be decoded, but recorded with a precision that feels administrative rather than poetic, as if the scribes believed they were preserving real measurements from a world where time did not behave as it does now. The Sumerian king list opens with a simple but loaded statement. Kingship descended from heaven, and the first cities received it before the flood, and what follows is a sequence of names anchored to specific places: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, each city paired with a ruler whose reign extends across thousands of years. This is not casual exaggeration, because the structure is consistent, the numbers deliberate, and the transition that follows unmistakable, as after the flood the reigns collapse abruptly into spans that resemble historical time, centuries giving way to decades, and the world suddenly becoming recognizable. The implication is not subtle. Something changed. Modern readers often attempt to resolve this by dismissing the early reigns as symbolic, numerological, or mythic shorthand, but the Sumerians themselves did not treat them that way, because they carefully separated the antediluvian world from what came after, marking the flood not simply as a disaster, but as a boundary between two modes of existence. Before the flood, time stretches and pools. Kings rule for durations that defy biology, and history moves slowly, almost imperceptibly. After the flood, time accelerates, life shortens, and memory fragments. This is not the only place where ancient traditions preserve such a divide. Across cultures, we find echoes of an earlier age in which beings lived longer, acted slower, and occupied a world less constrained by decay. And while modern science rightly rejects literal immortality, it has begun to acknowledge that human perception of time is not fixed, but deeply tied to environment, stress, and biological limits. The Sumerians, lacking our terminology, encoded this intuition into narrative, suggesting that the world before catastrophe allowed for a different relationship with duration itself. In this framework, The long reigns of antediluvian kings do not necessarily imply that individual humans lived for tens of thousands of years in bodies identical to ours, but that the conditions governing existence were fundamentally different, slower, more stable, less corrosive. Time did not press as hard. Change accumulated gradually. Memory endured. The world had not yet learned how to rush. This interpretation aligns with the broader cosmology already established, because a world closer to the Abzu, closer to primordial unity, would not experience the same fragmentation that defines later history. Just as separation introduced wind, sound, and vulnerability, further distance from origins introduced acceleration, entropy, and death. The flood, in this sense, becomes not only a physical event, but a temporal one, a compression of time that reshapes what it means to live and rule. The kings themselves are described less as conquerors and more as stewards, rulers of cities that feel more like anchors than empires, maintaining order rather than expanding it. Their authority is not enforced through armies or laws, but assumed as part of the structure of the world, as natural as the cycles governed by the earlier gods. They rule because the world allows it, and when the world changes, their kind of rule becomes impossible. This is where the tension deepens, because the Sumerian texts do not celebrate the flood as a necessary correction to excess alone, but as a rupture that permanently alters humanity's relationship with time, memory, and authority. After the flood, kingship returns, but it is diminished, constrained, increasingly dependent on force, ritual, and legitimacy rather than continuity. The world no longer remembers itself clearly, and so history must be recorded rather than lived. In this way, the antediluvian kings function as markers, not of political history, but of a lost temporal state, evidence that the world before the Anunnaki was not only structurally different, but temporally alien. It moved at a pace that cannot survive in the post-flood world, just as unity could not survive separation. Time itself became noisy, and it is here that the problem becomes unavoidable, because if the world before the flood allowed for such extended durations, then the flood represents more than destruction. It represents compression, the tightening of limits, the imposition of finitude on a species that had not yet learned to die quickly. This is why death, as a permanent condition, becomes central only after catastrophe, and why later gods become increasingly concerned with fate, judgment, and boundaries. The Anunnaki have still not fully arrived, but their necessity is beginning to emerge, because a world in which time accelerates requires regulation, and a species whose lifespan contracts must be told when its story ends. The long reigns of the antediluvian kings are not just implausible numbers on a tablet, they are the final echoes of a world that remembered how to endure. As the narrative draws closer to collapse, humanity shifts from survival to surplus, from rhythm to accumulation, and from living within cycles to reshaping them, because it is only when abundance appears that noise becomes unbearable, and the fragile structure holding the world apart begins to tremble, quietly preparing the way for a decision that will erase the last remaining traces of the old world. Long before fields were measured and harvests counted, before surplus reshaped memory and storage reshaped desire, the Sumerian texts recall a condition of human life that feels deliberately unfinished, a time when people existed within the rhythms of the land but did not yet command them, moving across open ground without fixed boundaries, feeding directly from what the world offered rather than extracting from it. In this earlier state, humans are not described as noble or degraded, only incomplete, clothed by necessity rather than fabric, sustained by gathering rather than cultivation, living close enough to animals that the distinction between species feels porous rather than absolute, because the surface world itself had not yet been fully claimed. The texts that preserve this memory do not frame it as a lost paradise, nor as a condition to be mourned, but as a threshold, a moment before a decisive shift that would permanently alter humanity's relationship with time, labour, and the land. The debate of sheep and grain captures this transition with unusual clarity, not as a historical account, but as a crystallized memory of transformation, presenting a world in which humans existed before agriculture, not as masters or caretakers, but as participants in a broader ecology that did not yet revolve around production. Sheep grazed freely, grain grew wild, and humanity lived among them without yet binding either to a system of ownership or control. When agriculture arrives in the Sumerian worldview, it does not emerge gradually through experimentation, nor is it framed as an inevitable evolutionary step, but as an intervention, a deliberate gift introduced by the gods Ashnan and Laha, personifications of grain and livestock, whose arrival marks a turning point rather than a continuation. With them comes abundance, but also obligation, because once food can be produced rather than gathered, it must be protected, stored, and defended, and the land itself must be reshaped to serve these new demands. Fields must be cleared, canals maintained, boundaries enforced, and calendars obeyed, and in this way agriculture introduces not only stability, but a new form of fragility. The Sumerians understood this intuitively, because the same irrigation systems that made agriculture possible also amplified disaster, turning seasonal floods into existential threats and tying entire communities to the behavior of distant rivers. To farm was to commit to the surface world fully, to invest in its rhythms while accepting that those rhythms could turn destructive without warning. The shift from gathering to cultivation did not simply increase food supply, it bound humanity more tightly to the unstable space between heaven and earth, further distancing it from the quieter, slower world remembered beneath. This transition reshapes human identity in the texts, because once humans begin to cultivate, they also begin to accumulate, and accumulation introduces comparison, hierarchy, and competition. Surplus must be counted, guarded, and redistributed, and with it comes the need for administration, authority, and eventually judgment. The surface world grows louder, not only with physical sound, but with social complexity. As disputes arise, ownership is contested, and power concentrates around those who control access to resources. What is striking is that the Sumerian texts never present this transformation as purely positive or negative, but as irreversible, because once humans learn to reshape the land intentionally, there is no return to the earlier condition. Agriculture locks humanity into a particular relationship with time, one governed by planting and harvest, scarcity and surplus, success and failure measured not by survival alone, but by yield. The old rhythms, once observed, are now manipulated, and in doing so they become less forgiving. This is where the memory of the pre-Anunnaki world grows faint, not erased, but obscured by activity, as humans become increasingly focused on maintaining what they have built rather than remembering what preceded it. The Abzu still lies beneath their feet. The cycles of sun and moon still govern their days, but attention shifts upward and outward toward fields, storehouses, and cities that demand constant care. Noise increases, not simply as sound, but as the accumulation of decisions, conflicts, and expectations that fill the air between heaven and earth. The Sumerian worldview suggests that this is the moment when humanity fully commits to the surface world, accepting its rules even as they strain against them, and in doing so they push the system closer to its limits. Abundance multiplies populations. Populations amplify disturbance, and disturbance travels upward through the domain of Enlil, who does not perceive it as progress, but as pressure. The world has become productive, but productivity comes at the cost of quiet, and quiet in this cosmology is not a luxury, but a requirement for balance. As fields expand and settlements thicken, the surface world begins to hum continuously, and the memory of earlier stillness becomes increasingly abstract, preserved only in ritual and myth. Humanity's success becomes its warning, because the structures that support abundance also amplify collapse, and the distance from the primordial state grows too wide to bridge gently. The stage is now set for a reckoning that will not arise from moral failure, but from systemic overload, because a world built on cycles can tolerate variation, but a world built on accumulation magnifies every deviation. As this tension comes fully into view, the Sumerian texts shift from quiet transformation to decisive action, as the gods respond not to disobedience, but to excess itself, and the sound of a thriving surface world grows loud enough to awaken forces that have remained dormant since the first separation. Forces that will not seek balance through adjustment, but through erasure. By the time the surface world reached maturity, by the time fields stretched farther than memory and cities layered themselves atop earlier settlements, the Sumerian texts describe a shift so subtle at first that it almost goes unnoticed, because nothing new is created and nothing visibly collapses, yet the air itself begins to change, filling not just with wind and breath, but with a constant hum of activity, voices, movement, labour, dispute and growth, a sound that does not belong to any single place, but emerges from accumulation, from the sheer density of life pressing into the narrow space between heaven and earth. This is the moment the texts identify not as moral failure, but as excess, because the world has become too full of itself, too active, too loud to remain stable. In the Atrahasis tradition, the gods do not accuse humanity of sin or corruption, but of disturbance, describing human noise as something that reaches upward and disrupts the order Enlil is tasked with maintaining. The language is strikingly impersonal, because the problem is not intention, but consequence. Not what humans mean to do, but what happens when their presence multiplies beyond the capacity of the system that contains them. Noise, in this sense, is not merely sound, but vibration, pressure, the constant agitation of the air itself, a signal that the balance established after the first separation is beginning to strain. This idea feels alien to modern sensibilities, yet it reflects a deep ecological intuition, because systems do not collapse only when actors behave badly, but when density exceeds tolerance, when growth outpaces structure, and when feedback loops amplify disturbance rather than absorb it. The Sumerians observed this in their own environment, where irrigation networks could support prosperity only up to a point, after which salinization, flooding, and collapse followed not because of error, but because of scale. Their myths encode this awareness, translating environmental pressure into divine perception. Enlil's response in the texts is not immediate annihilation, but escalation through measured attempts to restore quiet, first sending drought, then famine, then disease, each intervention designed not to punish, but to reduce, to thin the surface world back into a manageable state. These efforts fail not because humans resist, but because Enki intervenes quietly, undermining the measures through subtle acts of preservation, teaching humanity how to survive scarcity, how to store grain, how to endure. In this tension between Enlil and Enki, we see two philosophies of balance colliding, one enforcing limits, the other adapting around them. The narrative makes it clear that neither god is entirely wrong, because Enlil is responding to structural overload, while Enki is responding to the memory of what humanity is made from, recognizing that beings shaped from primordial material will always push against imposed constraints. Their conflict is not personal, but systemic, a disagreement over whether balance should be restored through reduction or resilience. As Enki's interventions succeed, humanity survives each imposed hardship, and in doing so, grows louder still, because survival breeds confidence, and confidence breeds expansion. Eventually, the texts suggest that incremental correction is no longer sufficient, because the system has crossed a threshold beyond which adjustment only delays collapse. This is the moment when the flood emerges, not as a sudden whim, but as a final reset, the only remaining mechanism capable of returning the world to a quieter state. The decision is framed not as vengeance, but as inevitability, the last option available to a structure stretched beyond its limits. What is often overlooked is that the flood is not described as falling from the sky alone, but as rising from below, as the waters of the Abzu surge upward in concert with the rains, collapsing the distinction between surface and depth, undoing separation temporarily, and allowing the older world to reassert itself. This is not destruction for its own sake, but reversion, the world slipping backward toward an earlier condition in which noise could not exist because space itself was filled. Humanity's fate at this moment is precarious because the same qualities that allowed it to survive famine and disease now make it incompatible with silence, and only through Enki's final intervention, whispered rather than proclaimed, does a fragment of humanity escape erasure. The warning given to Atrahasis or Ziusudra is indirect, encoded in dreams and riddles, because open defiance of Enlil's decree would destabilize the divine order itself, revealing that even the gods are constrained by the systems they maintain. This quiet conspiracy preserves not just life, but memory, because survival without remembrance would merely reset the problem, and so the Ark becomes not only a vessel of bodies, but of seeds, animals, and knowledge. A moving archive designed to carry fragments of the surface world through a collapse it cannot prevent. When the floodwaters rise, they erase cities, fields, and boundaries, but they do not erase the deeper patterns, because those patterns have already been transferred into motion. The Sumerian texts treat this moment with restraint, avoiding spectacle in favor of consequence. Because what matters is not the drama of destruction, but the shift it enforces, the permanent alteration of humanity's relationship with the world. When the waters recede, the surface world returns, but it is changed, quieter, smaller, more constrained, and humanity itself emerges diminished, no longer able to expand without limit, no longer capable of sustaining the noise that once filled the air. From within this altered world, survival unfolds as a quieter continuation rather than a return. As memory persists after catastrophe, fragments of the old order remain preserved within a tighter structure, and the world that rises from the flood carries both relief and loss, because although silence has been restored, something essential has been sealed beneath the waters, leaving humanity to live in the echo of what it once was. When the waters finally withdraw and the surface world reappears, it does not do so triumphantly or whole, but cautiously, as if unsure whether it is permitted to exist again, because the flood in the Sumerian imagination is not an interruption after which everything resumes as before. It is a boundary that cannot be crossed backward, a compression that permanently alters what the world can support. The survivors emerge not into renewal, but into aftermath, carrying with them the weight of what has been lost as much as the relief of what has endured, and this tension defines the new age that follows. Ziusudra steps onto land that looks familiar but feels different, because while rivers return to their courses and fields can be replanted, something fundamental has shifted beneath the surface. The world is quieter now, not only in sound but in possibility, as if the space between heaven and earth has tightened, leaving less room for excess, less tolerance for expansion. The Sumerian texts are careful here, avoiding celebration, because survival is not framed as victory but as concession, a compromise that allows life to continue under stricter conditions than before. What survives the flood is deliberately limited. Humanity persists, but reduced. Animals persist, but selected. Seeds persist, but curated. This is not abundance restored, but control imposed, and in this sense the Ark is not merely a vessel of rescue, but an instrument of regulation, carrying forward only what the new world can tolerate. The Sumerians understood that the flood did not erase complexity, it filtered it, compressing diversity into something manageable, and in doing so, it reshaped the trajectory of history. Time itself feels different after the flood, because the vast durations associated with the antediluvian kings do not return. Lifespans shorten, reigns contract, memory fragments rather than stretches. The world now demands record-keeping, accounting, and ritual reinforcement, because continuity can no longer be assumed. History must be written down because it no longer persists naturally. The flood, in this sense, marks the moment when humanity begins to remember deliberately rather than live within memory. The relationship between gods and humans also shifts subtly but decisively, because where earlier humanity functioned as a solution to divine labour, now it exists under closer supervision. The surface world has proven that it can grow too loud, too active, too demanding, and so limits are imposed not through constant intervention, but through altered conditions. Mortality becomes more pronounced. Resources become finite. Boundaries become enforceable. The world itself enforces what the gods no longer need to articulate openly. Yet the Sumerian texts do not present this as a fall from grace, because grace, in this cosmology, is not the absence of limits, but the ability to endure within them. The post-flood world is harsher but clearer, less forgiving but more stable, and humanity adapts as it always has, reshaping itself to fit the available space. Cities are rebuilt, but with memory of vulnerability embedded in their walls. Rituals evolve to acknowledge fragility rather than dominance. Kingship returns, but now legitimacy must be reaffirmed continually through divine favour and public order. What lingers most strongly after the flood is absence, because the world that existed before cannot be fully recovered, only gestured toward through myth, ritual, and longing. The Abzu still lies beneath the ground, the cycles of sun and moon still govern days and nights, but the direct continuity with the primordial past has been severed. Humanity now lives in a world that remembers forgetting, a world shaped as much by what it has lost as by what it retains. This loss manifests as a subtle unease that permeates post-flood society, a sense that stability is provisional, that prosperity invites scrutiny, and that excess carries consequences even when no decree has been issued. The Sumerians encoded this awareness into their stories, not as fear-mongering, but as instruction, because memory of collapse functions as a guide for survival. To forget the flood is to invite its return, not literally, but structurally, through the repetition of imbalance. As humanity rebuilds, something else begins to take shape alongside it, because a quieter, more constrained world requires new mechanisms to manage fate, to assign responsibility, and to regulate the shortened arc of human life. The old rhythms alone are no longer sufficient, and the memory of primordial unity has receded too far to guide behaviour directly. In this narrowed space, new figures will rise, not as creators, but as arbiters, beings whose role is to interpret limits rather than transcend them. The Anunnaki are approaching, not descending from the stars, but emerging from necessity, shaped by a world that can no longer rely on memory and rhythm alone to sustain itself. Their appearance will not mark the beginning of civilization, but the formalization of its constraints, because when a world has been broken once, it cannot be trusted to hold together without supervision. Within this fragile world, the Anunnaki emerge in their proper context, not as ancient astronauts or primordial architects, but as judges of fate shaped by necessity, arising in a reality that can no longer govern itself without structure, revealing that their ascent is not the origin of humanity's story, but a response to everything that has already been lost. When the Anunnaki finally enter the Sumerian narrative, they do not arrive with thunder from the sky or with promises of creation, nor do they introduce a new world into existence, because by the time their names are spoken clearly in the texts, the world has already been shaped, broken, flooded, and constrained, and humanity has already learned how fragile survival can be. Their appearance is quiet, almost administrative, emerging not at the dawn of time but in its aftermath, when memory has shortened and limits must be enforced rather than remembered intuitively. This is where modern interpretations often lose their footing, because the Anunnaki are not presented as builders of heaven and earth, nor as engineers of humanity, but as functionaries within a system that has become too complex to regulate itself organically. Their name, often misunderstood, does not describe beings who descended from the stars, but a lineage, a collective bound to authority derived from An, the distant sky, and their domain is not creation, but judgment. They are not architects of existence, but managers of consequence. In the post-flood world, time no longer stretches gently across millennia, but moves quickly, compressing human lives into short arcs that demand clarity, boundaries, and endings. Mortality has become unavoidable rather than exceptional, and with it arises the need to assign fate, to determine when lives end, when reigns conclude, and when balance has been restored or violated. This is the space the Anunnaki occupy, not above the world, but beneath it, in the realm where decisions about endings are made rather than beginnings. Their association with the underworld is not accidental, because the underworld in Sumerian thought is not a place of punishment or reward, but of accounting, where all lives ultimately arrive stripped of status and excess. The Anunnaki function as judges not of morality, but of allocation, ensuring that death occurs, that time remains finite, and that no being escapes the limits imposed after the flood. In this sense, they are guardians of scarcity, embodiments of a world that can no longer afford infinity. This reframing changes everything, because it reveals that the Anunnaki are not evidence of a forgotten technological civilization or extraterrestrial intervention, but of a psychological and cosmological shift, the moment when humanity recognizes that the world it inhabits is no longer open-ended. In the 20th century, however, one interpretation would come to dominate the modern imagination more than any other. Through the work of Zecharia Sitchin, the Anunnaki were reimagined not as judges of fate within a constrained world, but as visitors from another planet, arriving with technology, intention, and authority. Drawing on his translations of Sumerian texts, Sitchin proposed that humanity itself had been engineered, that civilization was imposed rather than inherited, and that the Anunnaki were not a response to collapse, but its architects. This interpretation did not arise in a vacuum. It resonated because it offered certainty where the ancient texts remain ambiguous, and because it transformed loss into intervention, replacing uncomfortable limits with external mastery. The gods of rhythm and cycle gave way to gods of fate and decree, not because of ambition, but because repetition alone could not govern a constrained reality. When memory fades and time accelerates, rules must be written. The Sumerian texts reflect this shift subtly, through changes in tone rather than overt declaration, as stories become increasingly concerned with contracts, oaths, boundaries, and consequences. Kingship, once an extension of cosmic order, becomes conditional, requiring legitimacy, ritual confirmation, and constant reaffirmation. Even the gods appear more bound than before, subject to councils, decrees, and limitations that did not exist in the earlier world. The Anunnaki do not create these constraints, they embody them. This is why the Anunnaki are feared but not adored, respected but not loved, because they represent the end of possibility rather than its beginning. They are invoked at moments of transition, death, and judgment, not at moments of birth or creation, and their authority feels heavy rather than generative. Inanna may cross realms and disrupt order, Enki may circumvent decrees through subtlety, but the Anunnaki remain fixed, unmoving, the final arbiters in a system that cannot tolerate ambiguity. Seen this way, the Anunnaki are not mysterious intruders into Sumerian mythology, but a sign of how far the world has drifted from its origins. They appear only when the old world has been fully sealed beneath water and memory, when the Abzu has been relegated to myth, and when humanity must be governed not by remembrance of unity, but by enforcement of separation. Their rise is not the beginning of civilization, but its tightening. This perspective also explains why later cultures struggled to interpret the Anunnaki correctly, because removed from the context of flood, loss, and compression, they appear arbitrary, ominous, and absolute, inviting speculation about hidden power and lost technology. Yet within the Sumerian framework, their role is tragically mundane, ensuring that nothing like the old world can return, that growth remains contained, and that silence, once restored, is never again completely broken. As the Anunnaki take their place, the surface world stabilizes further, but at a cost, because stability achieved through constraint lacks the quiet openness of earlier ages. Humanity adapts, as it always does, but the sense of something missing lingers, expressed in myths of lost ages, divine withdrawal, and unreachable beginnings. The Anunnaki stand at the threshold between memory and forgetting, ensuring that what has been sealed remains sealed. And so, as we move into the final part of this journey, the question is no longer who the Anunnaki were, but why their misinterpretation persists, why modern audiences are drawn to visions of gods from the stars, rather than to the more unsettling idea that ancient peoples remembered a world fundamentally different from our own, a world that could not survive the very conditions that allow us to exist today. Even after the Anunnaki take their place and the structure of the post-flood world hardens into something recognizable, the Sumerian texts never allow the earlier world to disappear completely, because memory, once embedded in myth, does not vanish when conditions change. It only recedes, surfacing in fragments, symbols, and recurring unease. And it is in these echoes that the final meaning of the pre-Anunnaki world reveals itself. The Sumerians did not preserve these stories to glorify the past or to imagine escape from the present, but to explain why existence feels constrained, why time presses forward relentlessly, and why civilization itself carries an undercurrent of loss that no amount of progress can erase. The primordial waters of Namu never return to the surface, but they remain present beneath everything, in the Abzu below the ground, and in the symbolic role water continues to play as both creator and destroyer. Flood myths persist not as historical curiosities, but as structural reminders that the world humanity inhabits is not the only one that has existed, nor the most stable one imaginable, but simply the one that survived compression. Across cultures, variations of this same memory appear, not because of shared invention, but because human societies everywhere grapple with the same intuition that something vast and quiet lies behind history, something lost not through moral failure, but through necessity. Modern archaeology, for all its precision, often encounters this intuition indirectly, in anomalous gaps, sudden transitions, and cultures that appear to emerge already complex, as if inheriting fragments of something older rather than inventing themselves from nothing. Göbekli Tepe rises without agriculture, monumental before cities, a surface echo of an older logic that does not fit linear progression, while submerged landscapes like Doggerland remind us that entire worlds can vanish beneath water with little trace, leaving behind only distorted memory. These discoveries do not confirm ancient myths literally, but they validate the underlying premise that loss on a civilizational scale is not hypothetical, it is inevitable. The persistence of alternative interpretations in the modern world, particularly theories that recast the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial visitors, reflects a discomfort with this idea, because it is easier to imagine lost technology stolen from the stars than to accept that humanity itself may be living in the aftermath of a world that could not endure. Ancient astronauts offer spectacle and externalize loss, while the Sumerian texts offer something far more unsettling, the suggestion that limits, mortality, and constraint are not imposed by invaders, but are the natural outcome of a universe that cannot sustain infinite growth or infinite quiet at the same time. In this light, the Anunnaki become symbols not of hidden mastery, but of acceptance, embodiments of a world that has learned how to end things cleanly, to assign fate, and to prevent a return to conditions that once proved unsustainable. They are feared because they remind humanity that some doors, once closed, cannot be reopened without catastrophe, and they are misunderstood because modern narratives prefer beginnings over endings, creation over consequence. What the Sumerians ultimately preserved was not a warning about gods or floods, but a meditation on balance, one that begins with unity, moves through separation, and settles into constraint, tracing a cycle that repeats at different scales across history, ecology, and even individual lives. Civilizations rise, grow loud, strain their structures, and are forced to reset, not always through water, but through collapse, migration, or forgetting. And each time the pattern repeats, quieter and faster, because memory shortens and lessons fade. To listen carefully to these ancient texts is not to search for prophecy, but to recognize continuity, to see that the world before the Anunnaki was not erased because it was inferior, but because it could not coexist with the conditions that allow complexity to flourish. Something had to be sacrificed for time to move, for breath to circulate, for life to multiply, and that sacrifice was openness, infinity, and silence. What remains is a world that works, but only within limits. As we stand in the present, surrounded by our own noise, our own acceleration, and our own systems straining under excess, the Sumerian memory feels less like distant mythology and more like a quiet mirror, reflecting patterns we continue to reenact without fully understanding them. The world beneath our feet still holds water, the air still carries vibration, and balance still depends on thresholds we rarely acknowledge until they are crossed. And if this journey through forgotten worlds has stayed with you, if these stories have given you something to reflect on or quietly carry forward, you're welcome to support the channel in the simplest ways, by liking the video, sharing it with others who enjoy exploring the deep past, or subscribing if you'd like to continue these long-form journeys together. Your presence here makes it possible for these stories to keep unfolding. The Sumerians did not leave us answers, only a framework for recognizing when a world is drifting too far from its foundations, and perhaps that is why their stories endure, not because they explain everything, but because they remind us that existence has changed before, will change again, and that beneath every ordered surface lies the memory of another world that once breathed differently. If you find yourself listening to these echoes late at night, in the quiet hours when the world seems briefly still, remember that silence has always been fragile. And if these stories resonate with you, consider staying with the journey, because the past has a way of speaking most clearly when the present finally pauses long enough to listen.